Tier 2. BYU is in there. And I think the only other team who's there is USF. And part of that is because they made the NCAA tournament for the first time in 20 years, 25 years. But the other component to that is that they have consistently been the next team along this route. Again, if I look over the course of the last 8 years, yes, they have an 8th place finish. That was the pandemic year. So I want to put a grain of salt on any of the pandemic year finishes, because we also saw St. Mary's finish 6th that year. And that was COVID hit them, COVID hit USF. So like there was a lot of teams that just were impacted in negative ways because of COVID. But if you remove that 1 year, USF, it's fourth place, 5th place, 4th place, 4th place, 4th place, 5th place, 6th place. They are consistently the next team below those three. And so I would put in Tier 2, there's just 2 teams in Tier 2 for me, and it's USF and BYU. That's Tier 2. Tier 3. Tier 3 is led by Santa Clara, who is the next most consistent team. And yes, they had a 3rd place finish last season. And that is the highest they've finished in the course of that entire run. However, this is a team that also, for the most part, is somewhere finishing between 5th and 7th. That has kind of been their MO over the last 8 years. They're consistently a okay but not great team. And that's where Santa Clara kind of is lumped in this 3rd tier, in this lower mid tier. So it's Tier 3 to me, Santa Clara. And at this stage, I'm going to also include Portland because of what they did last year. Obviously, I cannot go historically on this one. This is a team that's going to be involved in the conversation all year long. They belong in this tier right now. And they could jump. We'll see. And then right now, I think it's the interesting one, a team who also has kind of been consistently in, out, is San Diego. San Diego, while has not had a good run of it as of late, because their average finishes usually right around 7th over the last 8 years. But they brought in a lot of really good transfers. They now have a very interesting head coach in Steve Lavin. They're going to be the shiny object in the room for the WCC season, at least until conference play begins. What can San Diego do? Can San Diego make the leap with a lot of really good pieces that were added? And even last year, like even before that kind of like a little bit of not collapse, but how they started to slip late in the season. Keep in mind, this was a team that was, I believe it was 5-1 early on in conference play. So like, this is not a team that couldn't actually win in this conference, because they clearly were picking up wins early. What they couldn't do was sustain it against better teams. And that's what we'll need to see from San Diego this year. But for right now, that I put them in Tier 3 with Santa Clara, Portland, and San Diego. And then that leads me to my bottom tier, which is going to be Pepperdine, LMU, and Pacific. These 3 are right now typically take up the rear of the conference. LMU, as we already talked about, has a consistent up and down sort of pattern. And unfortunately, over the last, 15 years, it's been a lot of down. Same goes for Pepperdine. And obviously, they've had some really talented teams, but those talented teams have not been able to consistently make those count in the win-loss column. In the win column, I should say. Because even the Colby Ross teams, the Kessler Edwards teams, could not make that consistent leap. And of recent note, even to look the last 5 years, 10th place, 8th place, 6th place, 4th place, pandemic year, 10th place. There's a lot of talent on this team. There's a lot of young talent on this team. The challenge now is going to be whether they can turn it into wins. I would say that Pepperdine is, to me, like they're on that tier 3, tier 4 split line. They're on the cut line for me. So I could very easily move them up to that next one. Pacific is another one where they did bring in some good transfers, but outside of the Damon Stoudemire years, we have not really seen this team be consistent at a higher level or even at a mid level. And like without Portland, Pacific has, sorry, that's wrong. Looking at the wrong number. If you look at Pacific's finishes over, let's say, like the last 8 years, like, yes, you have like the Damon Stoudemire years where you have a 4th place, a 3rd place, a 5th place, but outside of those, you have 8, 9, 9, 7, 9. They have yet to prove that they consistently can move out of this bottom tier. And so for now, that's where I would have to keep them, is in that bottom tier with LMU and Pepperdine. Consistency is been the big hurdle for these bottom teams. Consistency is what keeps those top teams there. That's what keeps St. Mary's there. That's what keeps USF there. That's what keeps BYU there. It's what keeps, obviously, Gonzaga there, is consistency. Even Santa Clara, who is consistently right around that 6-7 mark, consistent. And the up and down nature of some of these other teams is what has me kind of pushing them further and further down the list. All right. Well, we'll get right into it and bring in Tristan Freeman, who is worked for words are hard right now. FanSided with Busting Brackets, and he covers college and pro sports. You can find him on Twitter at hoopsnut351. Tristan, how's it going?
I'm doing great. How you doing today, Zach?
Not too bad, not too bad. Little toasty here in California right now, but we're getting through it. So let's just kind of dive into it and talk a little bit about the WCC and what some of the prospectus is for the league. And let's start at the top. Let's start with Gonzaga. You have them as your number 2 in your preseason top 25. This is a team that brings back more starters than they anticipated actually bringing back. Obviously, with Drew Timme returning was a huge lift for Gonzaga. You have guys like Nolan Hickman and Hunter Salas who are going to return. And you have huge transfers like Malachi Smith coming in. So what's kind of like your outlook for this team? And obviously they're going to be in the conversation for a national title. But where does this compare maybe to some of the other years we've seen recently?
Yeah, I think this one stacks right up there when you look at the potential in the backcourt. Even though they don't have, 5-star Jalen Suggs, they do have a couple of former 5-stars in Hunter Salas and Nolan Hickman, guys who I think everyone believes is going to have that sophomore breakout campaign. And quite frankly, the only reason why I didn't have Gonzaga number 1 was because there's still a tiny bit of a question as whether or not Nolan Hickman can be a championship caliber level guard as a sophomore. You had Andrew Nembhard, you had Nigel Williams-Goss, you had, senior veteran leaders to run the offense. This time it's going to be a sophomore. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with Hickman. But everywhere else on the roster, it's pretty much set. You have one of the best shooters in the country in Rasir Bolton coming back for a 5th year, and he plays his role perfectly. He's very efficient, won't take up as much usage. You have Julian Strother, who I think showed flashes that he could be an elite scorer. Sometimes he sort of, flows in and out depending on what happens with the other guys, but he's someone who's an ideal wing. And then obviously Drew Timme is you would say is either number 1 or 2 best player in the country, next to Ostrich Way of Kentucky, a guy who can give you 20 points on 65% shooting. He's almost unstoppable one-on-one inside the basket, the ultimate security blanket. Gonzaga's, floor is probably the highest in the country. Their ceiling could probably be just as high too, depending on what happens with Salas and Hickman, as well as Malachi Smith, whose role is sort of unknown because will he be more of a ball handler? Will he be playing more off ball? will he be playing the 3 spot depending on whether or not Strother plays the 4? So there's still a lot of questions with Gonzaga, but I think just looking at their potential, there's no reason why you can't have expectations of Final Four at the bare minimum and potentially winning their first chip.
And with Gonzaga, because it does seem like they're so heavy at the guard position this year with guys who legitimately should be in this rotation, where maybe in years past, like we've seen like 1 or 2 guys and maybe 1 off the bench, where this team looks like they're 5 deep at the guard spot right now. And so how do you kind of see like the rotation working out, at least early on? Because I think that's one of the things that is going to be one of the challenges that Gonzaga faces, like who gets these minutes.
Yeah, I think the one guarantee is going to be Bolton getting 27 to 30 minutes at the 2 spot. I think everywhere else is sort of going to be a domino effect based on how good Hickman is. If Hickman can lock down the point guard position for 30 minutes in his own right, then that's going to have Malachi Smith likely get most of his minutes either as well as the backup point guard, but also the 3 spot. And that could put, Gonzaga in different lineups where they can either have Strother or Watson at the 4 next to Timmy. And there's also the case that you could argue that the best pure defender on the team could be Dominic Harris, who was out last season with a leg injury. He could probably get minutes as well, because I think Gonzaga's defense on paper is solid. But as you know, in the NCAA tournament time, you're going to need sometimes lockdown guys. So I think that could be where Harris sort of puts himself in position. And it could be, situational lineups. Maybe you have the best defensive lineup that includes Salas out there. Maybe you have a shooting friendly lineup that includes Bolton and Smith out there. I think there's a lot of different options based on your opponent that Mark you can utilize. But once it gets down to March, when he has this 7-8 man rotation, I think you can expect the veteran Smith in there, Bolton as well. And then we'll see whether or not if you trust Hickman in crunch time when it comes down to March.
I mean, it's going to be exciting to see this Gonzaga team, because obviously there's so much talent on this team. They've gotten to the point where they don't rebuild, they reload just every year, year in, year out. And again, one of the best players in the country with Timmy. It'll be real interesting to see what happens at the guard spot. Now with the WCC, I always kind of like, I'm looking at this league of like, who has the most to prove, who has like kind of like this, they need to kind of like make up for maybe what happened last year or whatever else, or like just kind of moving forward. And I think last year, like I clearly saw that was St. Mary's, and they proved everybody that they're still right there in the mix with Gonzaga and BYU as the top of this conference. Now heading into this year, I'm looking at this league and I'm thinking now it's actually BYU based on what we saw a year ago, because this is a team that finished 5th. They were really banged up in the front court. And now you lose guys like Alex Barcelo and Tejon Lucas. How do you kind of see like maybe the team that maybe has the most to prove in this league? Because for me, it's like, it's BYU.
Yeah, I think ironically, the same race for the Cougars when it comes to their expectations is the fact that no one thinks they can compete with Gonzaga. Like coming into the league a decade ago, the belief was they would either win the WCC most of the time or at least be 1-2 punch with Gonzaga. That hasn't happened, and they haven't won a championship and probably won't do so again unless they can somehow sneak by the Bulldogs in Vegas. And considering that they're leaving, their goal of trying to look impressive heading towards the Big 12, that's going to be a struggle regardless, because they're going to have to get much better talent. And whether you finish 2nd in the league or 5th in the league, they're going to have their own transition process that's going to take years